Okay, and hello, and welcome to a very special episode. I decided to spend some time in some spreadsheets this afternoon. There was an interesting topic that came up. And the question was, when should I use crit boost? And when should I use crit element? And while I can't give you the exact answer every single time, because it does matter based on the weapon, I can tell you what matters against the most for each monster. And so I don't know if this term has ever been brought up before, but I'm going to bring up a term. I'm going to coin it myself. Elemental ratio, which is to say, if we were to rank a monster's hit zone based off of how much elemental damage they take versus how much raw damage they take, how high is that elemental ratio? The higher the number, the more damage they take from element versus how much they take from raw. And of course, this is a very general assumption. It could be very different depending on the weapon, how fast it hits, how slow it hits. Let's go into an example. And first, before I go any further, I just want to point out there will be spoilers. I'm going to be going over every monster in the game. So every monster up until the release, title update 1 isn't out, we're going to be going over them, and we're going to be talking about their elemental ratio. And we're going to be going in ascending order. So we're going to start with the monster's least weak to element, going all the way up to the monster that has the most damage taken from element relative to how much raw damage they take. So to make a short example, we're just going to be going over a very brief explanation over how damage is calculated in Monster Hunter. If somebody really wants, I can go through the entire formula. We can go over sharpness modifiers. We could go over elemental sharpness modifiers. We can go over crit, elemental crit, things like that. But that's not the purpose of this video. The video is just to go into this elemental ratio, when we should be using element, and what type of element we should be using. So just to kind of make an example of, let's pretend we have these two made up weapons and we're going to be fighting Chatacabra, and we are going to be attacking his head with a cutting weapon. So we see here the damage that they take from cutting, from blunt, and from shot damage. Those are the three main damage types here. There is technically true damage. Things like shelling damage is true damage outside of the little bit of fire damage it does. And then we also have here on the side the various elements. So the 5 elements: fire, water, thunder, ice, and dragon. You can see here if we're attacking Chatacabra on his head, he takes 60% cutting damage and he takes 25% thunder damage. So we would probably want to use a thunder longsword or whatever thunder bladed weapon we have. You see here that ratio is 41%. Again, we're going to get into that. This number will make more sense the farther on we go. So the larger that number is, in general, the more damage they're taking in terms of element versus how much raw they're taking. So if we had a great sword, let's pretend it's a very early great sword. It has 100 raw. We just use a basic draw slash. So let's pretend it's like 50% motion value. That's to say that if you have 100 raw, it would take half of that and apply that as raw damage. So 100% there, 50% there, and then you take 60% of that number. So 60% of 50% of 100%, that's 50. 60% of 50 is 30. Pretty straightforward, pretty easy to know. It's just basic math. And then next, we add the elemental damage. So in this case, let's pretend this great sword has 140 thunder. When you see that 140, implicitly, you're taking 10% of that number. And again, his hit zone for thunder here is 25%. So that would add 3.5 damage. So the total damage you would see, assuming no other modifiers, the number that would float up on the screen would probably be like 34. That's the damage you would get from that one hit from a great sword. Now, let's look at sword and shield. Similar stats, again, something that would be similar that you would get at about that first elemental weapon you would make. Just a simple slash would do about 10% motion value. Again, on that 60% hit zone, would deal 6 raw damage. Then the 100 Thunder, which would again get multiplied by 10% against the 25% Thunder hit zone, would be 2.5, so that would be about 9 damage. Of course, you can see here, the 4 damage from Element is basically nothing on the Greatsword, whereas it is almost half the damage that you're getting from the Sword and Shield. Or rounded up, it is half the amount of damage that you're getting. So when we're going through this list, the rate at which you would want to really push into increasing your element a lot more is going to happen earlier with the faster hitting weapons, Sword and Shield, dual blades, bow, anything like that. And then on the very later end, you're getting weapons like Greatsword, Hammer. So it's going to have to be very late on where those sort of weapons are going to be things that you're going to be like, okay, I'm going to want to bring that. Alternatively, you could also bring your status/raw weapon. Let's say it's a status weapon. Once you've gotten your 2 statuses off or 3 statuses off, you could then switch to your elemental weapon and then maybe try to make up the difference there. Up to you. It's really up to you. There's too many variables for me to say for every single monster, 100% across the board, exactly what you should bring. But with that out of the way, we're going to get started. Again, I'm going to say spoilers, major, major, major spoilers, but we are going to be going over every monster. All right, so it's been a couple minutes so far. We're going to be here for a while. So first up, surprisingly, because it's very strange, Arkveld. Actually, Guardian Arkveld too, because according to Kiriniko, they share the exact same hit zones. So if we're attacking the head or the chain blade, I would say these are low to decent hit zones. Technically, these all should trigger weakness exploit. They're all 45% and above. But as you can see here, elementally speaking, he basically takes nothing. I mean, the head barely takes any. I think the wings take 2%. The only thing that I'm going to say here, and I'll repeat a bunch of times, there's a possibility that there is some sort of an elemental interaction going on here. I don't have the time to test it all the way through right now for every single thing. It may be we find out a month from now that if you hit enough times on his wings, he gets toppled way earlier. As it is, from my experience playing, Raw seems to work just as well as Element does, and you actually deal damage. So in this case, nearly across the board, I would bring status. I think Gunlance works amazingly well. Gunlance works great on everything, but it especially works well here because you're going to get a little bit of fire damage coming off of the Gunlance that might help trigger any sort of elemental reaction. And because, his best hit zones are still not that good, a lot of your damage is coming out from that true damage from your Gunlance shelling. So Arkveld, number 1 in the spot, not great for element. Next up, and this is very strange here. So Uth Duna. I was kind of surprised, and you might be looking at this, and first what's going to pop out at you is the head with a cutting weapon shows 50%. And honestly, that is a huge ratio. That is like a really, really big one. And if this were the only spot that we could hit, Uth Duna would be like way down the list. The issue is there's also the foreleg. Foreleg takes almost no thunder. 10% thunder is not very good. And it takes 65% cutting damage. Now, looking at impact, okay, thunder on the head is good, but I'm ranking this based off of cutting. Likewise, I may not even discuss shot at all. I'm going to mention cutting. We're going to be ranking it based off of cutting. I may mention impact. Shot, you just got to look on the side and extrapolate from there. The only thing with Uth Duna in the same vein as Arkveld is under the data mine, under the wiki, there is this mention of Veil. So whatever that shield comes up, I don't know exactly how that mechanic works. But in regards to that mechanic, Uth Duna is taking a lot of element. 25% is a lot of element, But under the same mine, it says 90% cutting. So even then, the ratio isn't that high. That's a good number. 25% is an amazing number. I'll take that number all day long. But when you're comparing 90% in the hit zone versus 25% Thunder, I would really only want to bring Thunder with like dual blades, maybe Sword and Shield. Hard to say. Again, we need to look more into that. And in the same vein, just like with Ulfduna, with new Udra, also not particularly weak. I mean, even in every situation, if we go through here, we see new Udra only takes 15% water. Now, if you are hitting the tentacles, and I'm not sure what an arm is versus a tentacle, this ratio is, again, very good. Water, 50% is a very good ratio when you're barely taking 30% raw damage. But again, if you're hitting the head, which some weapons can actually hit it relatively consistently, or you're hitting whatever the arm is, water is pretty good. The only thing is like when he's on fire, it almost feels like he takes better water damage. And then when he's not on fire, it almost seems like he doesn't take much water damage. What's the interplay there? It's still a little nebulous to me, similar to Ulfduna. Hard to say. Again, we'll have to do some experimenting, but as it is, you could probably get away with just using status or more heavily leaning on raw. Certainly when he's not in his fire mode, I think that water stays low and just goes high when he's on fire. Got to test it. Nerscylla. Relatively low on this list. Interesting because, the head only takes 15% fire. 30 is not a great ratio. And then when we look at the belly, okay, 20% is much better for Thunder. But then, the hit zone jumps up to 65%. You can see here for impact, you're somehow spinning on the stomach with the best Thunder Hammer in the game, you're going to get good results there. But again, this is another situation where you don't necessarily need to run heavy element. The only reason Jin Dahad isn't even lower is because he does technically take 20 fire on his head, and that's not terrible. But honestly, I wouldn't blame you for bringing Blast. This is another monster where true damage is really great. I mean, Gunlance really clears him so easily compared to Element. Element is just not really adding much here. There are other hit zones, but they're not up all the time. So if you are using Element, I'm going to say you got to really take the time, learn the fight, learn to focus the head. Otherwise, I don't know. Hit zones might change when they're broken. Again, Kiriko doesn't have that information, but based that's what's on there now in some of his forms, it doesn't seem to be that powerful. Yan Kutku. What a weird choice. What a weird choice because the head does take 30% ice, which is amazing for cutting and not bad for impact. The issue is if you've been playing this game for a long time, is that the wing takes 80% cutting. And it only takes 15% ice and it only takes 25% thunder. So this is an interesting one. You could really run this either way. If you don't care about going for the head, and I wouldn't, not really, you could bring a Thunder Greatsword, get the best of the both worlds, and just aim for the wings. Kind of an interesting choice. But even if you didn't want to run Thunder, even if you wanted to run something like Paralysis or Sleep, 80% raw motion value on the wings is huge. And an elemental ratio of 30% is not that big. It's a lot of damage. Like, he will take a lot of damage from Thunder on his wings. But if you're just getting so many more hits out because he's constantly paralyzed with good raw attacks to the wings, I think that's okay too. Ray Dow, a lot of the apexes. Still kind of low on the list. Now, this is around the point where I would say from this point on, 33% is kind of like a classic ratio. Like if you were playing Rise or Sunbreak and you just took the average of all of the hit zones and all the elemental ratios there, this is kind of like that midpoint. 33% is kind of like that midpoint because they take good raw damage, but they still take decent enough element. Again, it's going to depend a lot on your weapon, but it's okay. I wouldn't blame somebody if they brought paralysis or sleep, but it's okay. Impact, of course, 65% on impact. I would probably focus more, especially with, well, I mean, what are the two weapons we have? Hammer and Hunting Horn. I would probably just focus on raw or maybe even status, more paralysis. But this is the point for cutting where it starts to turn the corner. Zhou, this is a really confusing one. So main thing to point out in terms of like end game monsters is really the only one that takes really significant dragon. I guess there's Gore Magala that we'll get to later, but definitely right now there's not a lot of representation of dragon, and he is technically one of them, even though you're not normally fighting him quite a bit. Where it kind of shines is when he's in his more crystallized form. So when he's got kind of like that hard shell, I'm finding here that, you're getting a relatively decent ratio. And he's definitely the sort of monster where, again, like that weapon switching mechanic makes sense. The team usually does a really good job of having a monster somewhere in the game that highlights the new feature. And I think Zhou is in here to really highlight the value of weapon switching. So when he's in his crystallized state, you either want true damage or you might even want to lean very heavily on element to try and get those breaks. And then once he's broken, you want to switch over to your more raw heavy build and start focusing on that, especially looking at these wing arms here. 80% is a lot of raw damage. But, if you look at the wing arms before they're broken, again, you've got a pretty above average ratio of 37%. Speaking of Dragon and Gore Magala, he's right here. So, I remember looking at these hit zones at one point in the book and thinking that maybe Fire was better against Gore. Looking at it a little bit more at the hit zone you're most likely or you should be targeting most of the time, I would say that Dragon has a slight advantage. Those feelers, the antenna, are pretty rare. They're difficult to get unless you get the break, so I could definitely see somebody preferring to bring Dragon. Alternatively, when he is in his awakened form with his feelers, I could also see somebody just bringing paralysis to get him to stand the hell still to break the damn thing. It is 75% raw. It is 70% impact. In either case, if those antennae run out, you want to try and mobilize them to get the most damage out from either your raw or from your element. Again, though, in either case, once they're out, that's a good ratio. When they're not out, though, the head, it's honestly not a very good elemental hit zone. Kind of weird. Makes sense why he's a little bit lower on the list, but it is kind of weird. Still probably worth rigging Dragon, though. I mean, there are a lot of great raw Dragon weapons that have just a little bit of Dragon. Of course, all the Arkfeld weapons are that way. And it's not like Ardian weapons are terrible at raw. But you might want to consider bringing more raw boosting weapons here, even when he's in his awakened state. Shay Wu. Lower down the list, interesting use of our ratios here. Main thing is on the arms. I think you're going to be hitting those a lot more often than the head, but again, it depends on your weapon and its reach. 50% is a very high ratio. Alternatively, if you're hitting the mouth, and I know what the mouth looks like, I don't know how to know whether you're hitting or not. That's 100% motion value. I think in the off chance you accidentally hit anything, 25%, even with these higher ratios, 45%. I mean, Jin Dahad weapons hit really hard anyways. You should probably just bring ice. But if we're going by the head, it's a 35% ratio. Everything else is an amazing ratio, even with 100% motion value. This might be the highest motion value for element in the game, come to think of it. I just looked at all these numbers. That's a high one. Hirabami, noticeably good impact on the head. I include the tail motion values just as a point of comparison. But we can see here that averages are getting up to around 36% for cutting, which is, again, that's getting up there. You know, you're seeing the raw motion values fall. You're seeing, you know, going down from 60 to 55, and yet we're still holding with these 20%. You know, obviously, with the tail being 10% thunder, you'd want to bring fire and not thunder. Pretty straightforward. It's just Hirabami. We don't need to belabor the point. I could also, again, though, still see at this point wanting to bring paralysis just to keep the guy from flighting around. I mean, he spends a lot of time in the air, and it's kind of annoying attacking his tail. So, especially with impact, I would really want to bring like a paralysis hammer here just to keep him on the ground and then get KOs and then deal damage to the head. Lalabarina, again, this is our same sort of 55% raw motion value, 20% elemental hit zone that we saw before. I did include the petals because if they are out, you should know that they're a better hit zone. And not only are they a better hit zone, the elemental ratio is even higher. Weakest to fire, not a lot to talk about there. Guardian Rathalos. Super weak to dragon, 65% raw value here, but we're starting to see these base elemental weaknesses really creep up. So we're now at 25% elemental value on Guardian Rathalos with 65%. So in general, his head, extremely weak. Really, really a good hit zone for maximizing damage just in general. Congalala, 65%, 25%, exactly the same as Rathalos, except of course this time we're using fire. Slightly better raw damage on hammer here. We might start breezing through some of these more baby ones. Quematrice, 60% on the head, 20% water on the head, but tail is actually technically a better hit zone. Tail is 65% cutting, 25% water, again, falling right in line with Guardian Rathalos and Congalala. When I fight him, it seems like he likes to present his tail a lot. He doesn't seem to really target you too much with his head. He's got that one poke attack he does, but otherwise it seems like he's always showing his tail to you. So in either case, it seems like the tail is not a hard place to aim for. And if you are aiming for one thing when he's down, you should actually stay on the tail. Balahara, a little weird. If we're talking about the head, we're now seeing the elemental ratio go up to 40%. Again, that's because he's taking even less raw damage now, and he's still taking 20% elemental damage. Things change up a little bit, though, if you're attacking the tail. I don't know what the tail constitutes. I know there's a tail cut. I've seen it come off before. When does it stop being his tail? When does it start becoming his body? I don't know. In either case, it is a better raw hit zone, and it is a worse elemental hit zone. I think just the way Balahara moves, for the most part, it's going to be hard to chase the tail all the time anyways. You're probably just going to be going for the head. But if you decide you want to try and go out and be the world's foremost speedrunner of Balahara, this is information that might be useful to you. Doshiguma. Here we're starting to see even worse raw motion values. We're at 48% cutting on the head, 54 impact on the head, and we're still holding steady at 20%. So at this point, our elemental ratio is in the 40s, not because the element is incredibly good, but just because our raw is starting to get pretty bad. Here's Chatacabra. We were talking about him earlier. Big difference here is now it's 60% on his head and 25% thunder. One thing to note is he keeps that same thunder resistance on his tongue, but whenever he leaves his tongue out, you always want to go in for that focus strike because 85% raw motion value is a lot of motion value. And again, I was joking a little bit about Balahara. I don't have to say anything about Chatacabra. I doubt anyone here is speedrunning Chatacabra, but if you see the tongue, it really is a very good hit zone. Up next, Rompopolo. 60% cutting, 25% water. Again, impact is slightly better here. We're looking at just slightly under 40%, but I would still say 65 and 25% is around that point. Almost 40% is about at that point where I'd really start heavily consider bringing element in this fight. And it's only going to stay this way going forward. Pretty much from this way forward, anyone you're fighting, it's like, why haven't you been using element? It is really good at this point. Blinganga, 70%. So now we're actually seeing really good raw motion values, but at the same time, we're seeing incredibly good elemental values. 30% fire is a lot of fire. It very rarely popped up in Rise. I think it was like Narwa's Sack. Narwa's Sack was 100% motion value. And I think it was it was between 30 and 40% dragon, but it was enough to be like, okay, if I've got dragon, I may as well use it. Rathian, her head is the same thing as Blinganga. You're looking at 70 and 30% there. So again, very, very weak to dragon. Rathalos, actually even better for dragon than Rathian because he takes slightly less cutting on the head. He has an even higher elemental ratio here, getting up to 46%. Guardian Fulgur Anjanath. I was surprised. 30% ice, 30% dragon on the head. Now, the nose bone technically has different motion values on it. I don't have them included here, but it's about the same for ice. I don't know if it's the same for dragon, but in either case, you're unlikely to bring dragon because you also might want to break the legs sometimes to help get a trip. And in that case, you're going to be bringing ice anyways, which has an even higher elemental ratio. Something to point out, I know I said I wouldn't talk about gunning that much. 10% shot motion value on the legs. This is a 200% elemental ratio. It's kind of amazing. Okay, I think we have... we still have a good couple more. Okay. Next up, Guardian Doshiguma. Again, we're kind of seeing this is incredibly high ratio here of 25% fire, 55% cutting. But more interestingly enough, it's actually his forelegs that are weak and not his head. His forelegs take 60% cutting and 30% dragon. Now, the hard part about this is... fire is the more generally good element on him. But if you were a true God gamer and you were able to pinpoint his legs the entire time, 50% is a very good elemental ratio. It's a little bit up to you. I mean, it's a better cutting hit zone either way. Fire is still very good. Well, it's all right. It's 33%. But if you could land the God hits on the legs, it's something to keep in mind. Ajarakan, now we're starting to see the real lower limits of raw motion values. So his head just barely qualifies for weakness exploit. Meanwhile, water is at 25%. So this is a real large, like this is almost the highest ratio you would see in most normal situations in Monster Hunter, 45% and 25%. Very rarely you'll see something like a 45% and a 30%. Usually it's not more than that unless you're seeing like some of the more like rocky monsters, some of the more interesting ones. Foreleg here, just as another point, if you are aiming for something, they are technically better hit zones overall than the head. Again, hard to say whether you want to go for the head, you want to go for the arms. I don't know if one has a different flinch reaction versus another, but in either case, water is definitely very good here. Okay, so next up is very strange. It's Gypceros, who is a strange monster. And it's strange because he is both a monster that has one of the best ratios and also a monster that has some of the worst ratios. In my mind, I think most people, when they fight Gypceros, the first thing they want to do is break his head twice so he can't flash you anymore. In that case, amazing elemental ratio on the head, 67% on the head. You'd want to bring this on just about anything just to get it broken faster. Even on hammer, 55%, you still want to fire hammer here. But once that's broken, The tail is a 70% raw motion value. And the ratio is no longer that good. Fire is only 20% on the tail. Now, I don't know what paralysis is like on Gypceros. I don't even know if he can be paralyzed. And if he can, it's probably shorter. I think. I don't know. I'm not looking at it in front of me. Sleep is probably okay. That's up to you. What do you want to bring? If it were me, it's just Gypceros for now. I would probably just bring Gunlance and wouldn't think about it. If I was using anything else, I would still probably just bring Fire and not think about it. If you're trying to be the world's best speedrunner of Gypceros, you might want to bring something to immobilize them and get better hits off on the tail. Just something to keep in mind. All right, down to the last few. Guardian Ebony Odo. 45% cutting, so again, just barely triggering weakness exploit on the head. 40% water. I mean, if there's one monster in the game, and it's funny because he also gives you burst, which is not a bad elemental skill that you want to continue to use element on. I mean, it's this guy. Now, if you didn't know, using element on his mouth or his head does cause a special topple. It kind of powers him down. It puts him a little bit more into his normal Odo moveset compared to his Ebony Odo moveset. So it's something you're going to want to do anyways. But even outside of that, water is real good. Okay, last entry here. Caveat again, because for now, it only has one set of damage numbers. So it only has a set of damage numbers in their normal state. It doesn't show the damage numbers in their broken state. So this is not going to be 100% accurate. Gravios. 25% cutting, 35% water, 140% ratio. Now, I'm sure when it's broken, the belly probably becomes at least what? 45%? 55%? 60%? Does water stay the same? I don't know. Too many monsters to go over, and I don't have time to test every single one. I think even if it went up to 60%, let's even pretend it went up to 80%. Let's say it went to 100%. It does not go to 100%. It's actually still a pretty good ratio. Bring water. It's Gravios. Why would you not bring water? You need to break the stomach in the first place anyways, and you're not doing it with cutting. Now, again, if it were me, it's wilds. I would probably bring Gunlance, break the belly, and then switch to something else. But if you're just using one weapon, bring water. It's going to really help you break the belly, and then you'll continue to do good damage. Okay, long video. Hopefully this was a helpful explanation / discussion / data dump on elemental ratio as they exist in the monsters right now. If you like the video, let me know. I would consider doing a follow-up when we get the new title updates, when we get new monsters and stuff like that, just to kind of create little addendums and talk about what the strategy is. Maybe in the future, we'll even cover all of their different hit zones so you can know if for each exact spot, for some reason you're targeting claws instead of the head or tail instead of the head. You can know what those are as well. Let me know. In either case, thanks for watching. Goodbye.